Everyone saw the officer approach the old stray dog with disgust, but no one expected what came next. In just 5 minutes, a harmless kick turned into a life-altering mistake, and when the truth about the dog's past came to light, that same officer would find himself face to face with a justice far more brutal than the one he thought he controlled. The town of Granger was small, tucked away between quiet highways and rustling fields, where everybody knew each other, or at least thought they did. On most mornings, the streets were calm. Elderly residents swept their porches. Children walked to school in little clusters, and Officer Reynolds made his routine rounds in a worn-out patrol car. He was a man of firm routines and sharper opinions, especially when it came to animals roaming the streets. Among the townsfolk, an old dog had become a familiar sight. Mangy, limping, and clearly past his prime, the dog wandered the same sidewalks every day, never bothering anyone. Some said he'd once had a family. Others whispered he was smarter than he looked. They called him Tank, a name that didn't quite match his frail body but somehow fit the way he moved, slow and steady, like a soldier carrying unseen weight. Tank never begged, never barked, never caused trouble. He simply was. A presence. An old soul surviving on scraps and instinct. The kids at the elementary school left him bits of lunch, and Mrs. Holloway from the bakery always left out water and stale bread near the alley. But Officer Reynolds saw only a nuisance. To him, Tank was a symbol of disorder. Strays in his mind meant laziness, irresponsibility. They didn't belong in his clean town. So when he saw the dog curled up outside the station door that Thursday morning, damp from the night's rain, something snapped. Witnesses would later say the kick was sudden, unprovoked. A cruel jab of a boot that lifted the old dog off the ground with a yelp that echoed down Main Street. Most people turned away, uncomfortable. No one intervened. No one, except a teenage girl across the street, camera phone in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. Tank didn't bite back. He didn't growl or flee. He simply stood, wobbled slightly, and walked away slowly, as if he knew something Officer Reynolds didn't. Within minutes, that officer's entire world would begin to unravel, and it would all start with a single online post that went viral far faster than he could chase it down. Within hours of the incident, the video taken by the teenage girl, her name was Harper, had begun circulating online. She hadn't meant to stir trouble. She simply posted it on her private account, captioning it with a mixture of shock and sadness. "He kicked that old dog like it was trash. How can someone wear a badge and do that?" But the internet doesn't play by small-town rules. By lunchtime, the clip had been shared over 40,000 times. By evening, national pages had picked it up. Animal rights activists, influencers, even former police officers were weighing in. Hashtags flooded in, of justice for Tank, of no badge for cruelty. Granger shame. Officer Reynolds remained unaware, for a few hours at least. He returned home from his shift, grumbling to himself about that mutt and the puddle it had left by the precinct door. His wife noticed his mood but had long since stopped asking questions. He turned off his phone, opened a beer, and sat in silence. Meanwhile, the town was waking up. Mrs. Holloway from the bakery closed early, her hands trembling as she watched the footage. She had fed Tank for years. The thought of someone harming him, especially an officer, filled her with a rage she hadn't felt since her husband passed. She printed a still frame from the video and taped it to her storefront window, scribbled in black marker, "This is not justice." At the high school, Harper sat nervously in the counselor's office, her phone buzzing every few seconds. She hadn't expected her post to explode the way it had, but something told her it needed to. "People have to know," she said quietly, hands clenched. "He didn't just kick a dog, he kicked something that trusted this town." Later that day, something even stranger happened. A woman in her 60s arrived at the sheriff's office, asking to speak with whoever was in charge. She was quiet, composed, but firm. She held a small, laminated photo in her hand. The sheriff, overwhelmed by the sudden PR disaster, met her in the lobby. "Ma'am, I understand there's been some confusion." "No confusion," she interrupted. "That dog, the one your officer kicked, he saved my husband's life in Kandahar." The sheriff blinked. "Come again." The woman laid the photo on the desk. It showed a much younger Tank, harnessed in military gear, eyes sharp, standing beside a smiling man in fatigues. His name was Sergeant back then. My husband trained him. He sniffed out 4 IEDs during one mission alone. He wasn't just a dog, he was a soldier. Silence fell over the room. The sheriff picked up the photo, studying it with disbelief. "You're telling me that stray is a retired military canine?" "Yes. After my husband died, I couldn't care for him. I was dealing with too much. He ran off one night. We never found him, but I know his eyes. I'd know them anywhere. That's Sergeant. That's Tank." By that evening, the sheriff had placed Officer Reynolds on administrative leave. It wasn't just the public outcry now. It was the revelation that the officer had assaulted a decorated military service dog, one who had been abandoned by the system, not by choice. Marta, a wildlife biologist who had worked with rescue dogs before, offered to examine Tank if anyone could find him. "Dogs like him remember everything," she said softly, watching the footage for the 10th time. "If he hasn't lashed out, even after being hurt, it's because he's trained, disciplined, but that doesn't mean he's not scared." The hunt for Tank began that same night. Locals spread out across the town with flashlights, kibble and soft voices calling his name. Some used Sergeant, others stuck to Tank. Kids made posters. An elderly man donated old army blankets to create warm corners in alleyways, but Tank was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the old dog had vanished into the shadows, retreating from the very people who once called him family. The guilt settled heavily over Granger. Harper, unable to sleep, scrolled through the comments on her video. Most were filled with support, some with fury, but one stood out. It was from an account with no profile photo. "That dog saved my life too. I was on patrol with Sarti Daniels the day Tank found that third bomb. Tell the people in Granger, you don't kick heroes." Chills ran down Harper's spine. She screenshotted the comment, knowing this story was far from over. Somewhere out there, an old soldier walked on 4 legs, wounded not by war, but by the town he once tried to protect. And karma. Karma was just getting started. The next morning, the atmosphere in Granger was different. The town square, usually quiet and filled with casual chatter and the smell of fresh coffee, was buzzing. The bakery didn't open. The hardware store stayed closed, but a crowd began to form anyway, right in front of the police station. People came not with signs or shouts, but with quiet conviction. Photos of Tank, screenshots from the video, images edited with "Justice for Sergeant," were taped on windows, lampposts, and even pinned to jackets. Harper stood among them, clutching a printed version of the online comment that had kept her up all night. She had tried contacting the user who claimed to have served with Tank, but there had been no response. Still, something told her it was real. It felt real. And the people around her, veterans, teachers, students, retirees, they all agreed. The town had made a mistake, and it needed to make it right. Inside the station, Sheriff Walton hadn't slept. He was sifting through old records, trying to verify the woman's claim from the day before. It wasn't easy. Military dog service files weren't public, and given the years that had passed, Sergeant might have been renamed, reassigned, or quietly discharged. Still, there was one file that caught his eye, K9 742B, Belgian Malinois, active in Kandahar, transferred stateside in 2015, last handler, Sagat, Martin Daniels. Notes included injuries from shrapnel, PTSD-like symptoms, and a commendation for service. The dog had been deemed too bonded for reassignment, but the final entry was what made the sheriff pause. Final placement, requested by Sarti Daniels' widow, released into her care. No further follow-up. That was it. No microchip, no tracking, no official updates, just a name and silence. "Jesus," Walton whispered. "It is him." Meanwhile, across town, Tank was finally found. A volunteer named Luis, a retired vet tech, had followed a trail of paw prints out toward the edge of the old railway depot, abandoned, overgrown. Near the rear loading dock, in a nest of flattened cardboard and leaves, lay Tank. His breathing was shallow, his side bruised, but his eyes opened when Luis called out softly, "Sergeant." The dog lifted his head. Luis knelt, gently offering a piece of jerky. "You remember that name, don't you?" he said, voice catching. "You remember who you are." Tank didn't move much, but he wagged his tail once, slow, deliberate. Word spread quickly. Within 20 minutes, Marta and Harper arrived. They approached carefully, not wanting to spook him. Tank didn't resist when Marta checked him over, her hands methodical but tender. "No broken bones," she said. "He's in pain, but he's tougher than he looks." Harper sat nearby, holding her phone up. "You're going to be okay now," she whispered. "They know who you are." She hit record. That video, a shaky 30-second clip of a battered dog lifting his head to the sound of a kind voice, and the name Sergeant, would reach 2 million views in under 24 hours. Back at the station, Officer Reynolds was watching the chaos unfold from behind closed blinds. He still didn't understand why people were making such a fuss. It was just a stray, he muttered to himself. Nobody even owned it. But then his phone rang. It was the sheriff. "You need to come in," Walton said, tone unreadable. "Now." When Reynolds arrived, he found the sheriff waiting with a file on his desk and the widow of Sergeant Daniels seated nearby. The moment she saw him, her lips curled, not in fear, but in controlled, icy fury. "You kicked him," she said. "You kicked a soldier." Reynolds blinked. "With respect, ma'am, that dog was a stray. I had no way of knowing—" "That's not the point," Walton cut in. "The point is you didn't care." He slid the file across the desk. "This is the confirmation. That dog, Tank, Sergeant, whatever name you use, was officially part of the United States Armed Forces. He served. He saved lives. And now the entire world knows that a cop in Granger kicked him like garbage in front of a child's school." Reynolds paled. What happens now?" "You're suspended indefinitely," Walton replied, "and you can expect a formal investigation from the department, internal affairs, and possibly even military legal counsel. You didn't just violate conduct, you desecrated a symbol." Outside, the crowd began to cheer. Not because Reynolds was suspended, but because Luis had arrived with Tank. The old dog, weak but upright, was seated in the back of a pickup truck padded with blankets. Harper stood beside it, holding a hand-painted sign, "Welcome home, Sergeant." Children waved. Veterans saluted. One old man removed his cap and laid it over his heart. Tank didn't bark. He didn't move much. But his eyes scanned the crowd slowly. And then, after a long pause, he lowered his head to rest on the blanket, content, safe. And just a few blocks away, Officer Reynolds sat in the sheriff's office, staring at a photo of himself on the front page of every major news outlet in the country. The headline read, "Anti-Animal Cop Kicks War Hero Dog, Faces Immediate Suspension." But karma wasn't finished yet. The town of Granger had seen its share of local scandals. Embezzled funds, zoning disputes, even a mayoral fistfight back in the 80s, but nothing like this. The image of Tank, now known nationally as Sergeant, resting quietly in the back of Luis's pickup, had become the town's defining symbol overnight. Flags went up in front of houses. Hand-drawn posters of Tank appeared in shop windows, coffee shops, and the post office. But for Officer Reynolds, the fallout was only beginning. 2 days after his suspension, he was officially served notice. An internal investigation by the state police had been opened, alongside a complaint filed by the widow of Sergeant Martin Daniels. What began as public outrage was now a legal crisis, especially after the Department of Veterans Affairs confirmed that Tank's military service made him eligible for federal protection under certain honorary animal laws. That meant the abuse wasn't just unethical, it might be criminal. Reynolds' lawyer advised silence, but his ego had other plans. He reached out to a local radio station to give his side, claiming that the footage was taken out of context and that the dog had growled at him first. The interview backfired spectacularly. Listeners flooded the station with angry calls, and one ex-soldier phoned in to say, "If that dog growled, it's because he sensed something the rest of us missed. Animals don't lie, people do." Meanwhile, Harper was invited to speak at a regional animal welfare event. She wore a borrowed dress and trembled the entire drive to the Civic Center, but once on stage, she held the microphone with quiet strength. "I didn't post the video to be famous," she said, voice cracking slightly. "I posted it because no one else did anything. I saw someone hurt a dog that never fought back. A dog that, turns out, spent his life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I didn't know he was a soldier, but I knew he didn't deserve that." Her words went viral too. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by a national morning show. A producer contacted Marta and Harper, asking if they could fly out for a televised interview. They declined. Granger had become a media storm, and neither of them wanted to parade Tank around on live television while he was still recovering. Instead, the interviews came to them. Reporters lined the sidewalks, filming from outside Luis's house where Tank now rested on a padded dog bed under a porch awning. Luis, overwhelmed but kind, answered only one question. "Why do you think this story matters to so many people?" He paused. "Because it reminds us that the smallest things we ignore, like an old stray limping down the road, sometimes carry the biggest stories. And maybe we're all a little guilty of looking away too soon." But the biggest twist came from a direction no one expected. On the 6th day after the incident, a black SUV rolled into town with tinted windows and government plates. It pulled up quietly in front of Luis's house. Two men in suits stepped out. They weren't reporters or bureaucrats. They were military. Specifically, they were from the U.S. Army's War Dog Memorial Foundation. They introduced themselves with calm professionalism and requested to meet Sergeant. Luis nodded and called gently, "Tank." "Visitors." The old dog stirred, his ears flicking as he slowly pushed himself up on trembling legs. One of the men knelt down and extended a gloved hand, not to pet him, but to salute. The other removed a box from the SUV and opened it to reveal a folded flag, a commendation plaque, and a medallion engraved with the name Sergeant K9 742B. It was official. The Army had reviewed the footage, confirmed Tank's service, and authorized an honorary re-recognition of his years of duty. Luis's voice cracked as he asked, "What happens to him now?" The taller officer smiled gently. "He stays with you, if you'll have him. This isn't a transfer, it's a thank you." As the men stood and turned to leave, Harper caught one of them glancing toward the police station. She asked quietly, "What about the officer who kicked him?" The man's face turned hard. "Justice has its own path, but sometimes a nation watches, and sometimes that's the only court we need." Later that afternoon, the footage of the military officers saluting Tank would spark another viral wave, this time under the hashtag Salute for Sergeant. People across the country, from firefighters to school children, began posting their own photos and videos saluting their pets, service animals, or even plush toys in tribute. Back in the sheriff's office, Reynolds watched the news on a muted screen, eyes sunken, hands trembling. His lawyer informed him that an administrative panel was being convened, not just for his suspension, but to review every past complaint he'd received. Apparently, Tank wasn't the only animal he had mistreated. A former colleague spoke anonymously to the press. He used to brag about kicking strays, called it cleaning the streets. I guess he finally kicked the wrong one. Reynolds didn't respond. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. And for the first time in his life, the world wasn't listening to him. It was listening to the dog he tried to silence. And Tank? That night, under a quiet sky and wrapped in the warmth of an old army blanket, he slept soundly. No longer a stray, no longer forgotten. A soldier honored. A hero returned. But one thread remained unresolved. Harper had noticed something odd in that original video, something no one else had caught. And she was about to dig deeper. The detail was small, barely noticeable. But Harper had watched the video dozens of times, and something kept bothering her. Not about the kick or Tank's reaction, but about the moment right before, a second of hesitation in Officer Reynolds' posture, a glance over his shoulder, as if he wasn't just reacting to the dog, but checking for someone. She downloaded the original file and slowed it down frame by frame. There it was. Just before lifting his foot, Reynolds looked not at Tank, but toward the alley across the street. His expression shifted, tightened, like someone who knew he was being watched but didn't care. And then Harper remembered something else. The morning of the incident, She had passed a man in that same alley. He was hunched over a box of tools, working on a power junction. She hadn't thought much of it, but what if he saw something, or had footage from another angle? She texted Marta, who put her in touch with someone on the city council. Within hours, Harper had a name: Jordan West, a contracted electrician working on the public lighting circuit. He'd been servicing the junction near the alley camera the same morning Tank was kicked. With her heart pounding, Harper called the number she was given. Jordan was hesitant at first. He didn't like getting involved, but when Harper mentioned the dog, his tone changed. "Yeah," he said. "I saw it happen. I was about to yell at the guy when I saw him look my way. I just froze. But listen, I've got something else." He explained that his service box had a mounted GoPro. "For insurance," he said. "Stuff gets stolen off the truck sometimes. I leave it running while I work." Harper's breath caught. "Do you still have the footage?" He did. An hour later, they met at the diner near the outskirts of town. Jordan handed her a thumb drive and said only, "Watch it to the end." Harper went home and opened the file on her laptop. At first, it confirmed what she already knew. Reynolds approaching the dog, muttering to himself, the cruel kick, Tank's whimper. But then, a minute later, Reynolds pulled out his phone. He wasn't calling dispatch. He wasn't texting. He was deleting something. Then, at timestamp 5:02, Harper saw it. Reynolds crouched briefly and reached into his jacket. He pulled out a leather glove, torn and blood-stained, and shoved it into a nearby trash bin before walking back toward the station. The timestamp matched precisely 5 minutes after the kick. Harper's blood ran cold. She called Marta immediately. "I think Tank wasn't just in the wrong place. I think he saw something." Together, they brought the footage to Sheriff Walton. He watched it 3 times in silence, jaw tightening with each replay. "That glove," he muttered. "We need to find that trash bin." But it was too late. The bin had already been emptied. However, Marta had an idea. "Granger Waste Services doesn't process garbage until Fridays," she said. "If we act now, it might still be at the transfer station." The sheriff didn't wait. He radioed 2 deputies and drove with Harper and Marta out to the county dump. What followed was 5 hours of sifting through trash bags in the early summer heat. Flies, heat, and the stench of rot didn't deter them. Harper kept repeating, "We're not just looking for a glove. We're looking for a reason Tank got hurt." Then, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, a deputy shouted, "Got something!" Wrapped in damp newspaper, half soaked in soda, was a black leather glove, torn at the palm, with what looked like dried blood on the fingertips. Inside, folded tightly, was a card. It was smeared and bent, but Harper recognized the words, "Department of Animal Control, evidence tag 1183. The glove had been part of an active case, a sealed case. Back at the station, Sheriff Walton pulled up internal records. Case 1183 had been closed 3 years prior, illegal dogfighting ring just outside of town, 10 arrests, 9 convictions, but 1 suspect had walked free due to lack of evidence. A man named Clay Dobson. "Guess who made that evidence disappear?" Walton said grimly. Reynolds had been the responding officer. The truth crashed into place like thunder. Reynolds hadn't just kicked Tank because he disliked strays. He recognized him. Tank had likely been there the night of the dogfighting bust. Maybe he'd even been a confiscated witness, a ghost of a case Reynolds had tried to bury. "Tank saw something that could have come back to bite him," Marta said, her voice cold. "So Reynolds made sure he got to Tank first." The sheriff didn't hesitate. He filed for an emergency warrant that same night. At 3 a.m., officers entered Reynolds' home. In a locked drawer, they found more gloves, some stained, others clean, and a file folder marked Dobson 2019. Inside were photos, notes, and a list of items Reynolds had claimed were lost in transfer. He hadn't just kicked a dog, he'd silenced a witness. And now, that witness had brought the truth howling back to the surface. By sunrise, the mood in Granger had shifted once again. What had begun as an act of cruelty against a stray dog had now unraveled into something much deeper, something darker. The revelation that Officer Reynolds had tampered with evidence in a dogfighting case was spreading through town like wildfire. But what really stunned people was this. A dog had remembered. Tank, once seen as nothing more than a limping shadow in the street, had become the key to exposing a cover-up that had been hidden for 3 years, and he had done so not with force, but with silence. The kind of silence that sees everything. At the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was electric. Investigators from the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation arrived before 9 a.m., taking control of Reynolds's files, computer, and incident logs. Sheriff Walton didn't resist. In fact, he welcomed them in. "I should have seen it," he told Harper and Marta, standing outside his office, exhausted but resolute. Reynolds always played things too clean, never filed full reports, always said it was handled on site. "I just didn't want to believe someone wearing this badge could be that crooked." Harper was quiet. She didn't need to say anything. The facts were speaking loudly enough. Meanwhile, across town, Luis sat beside Tank on the porch. The old dog was resting more now. His breathing had evened out, his wounds healing slowly under Marta's careful attention. But something in Tank's demeanor had changed. He no longer flinched when someone approached. When children came by with notes and treats, he would raise his head, tail thumping gently. He was beginning to trust again. Luis noticed it most when he reached for his boots one morning. As he leaned down, Tank scooted forward and rested his chin on Luis's foot. No fear, just quiet presence. "Good boy," Luis whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You did more than any of us could." But the fight wasn't over. In a closed-door meeting, Sheriff Walton briefed the town council. "We believe Reynolds covered for Dobson during the dogfighting raid. Evidence suggests Dobson bribed him. Reynolds then lost the glove, which likely tied Dobson to the pit." He paused. "Tank may have been one of the dogs rescued from that operation." Gasps filled the room. A councilwoman asked, "Do we have proof?" Walton nodded slowly. "We will. Marta's having Tank tested for old scars. Microchip fragments, anything that confirms he was there, but the behavioral link is already undeniable. The dog reacted to Reynolds with fear before the kick. And when he saw the glove, he sniffed it and immediately tucked his tail. That wasn't all. The file folder found in Reynolds's drawer contained a receipt, an unreported transaction from a pawn shop dated 1 week after the raid. The item, a silver necklace matching the description of one taken from Dobson's property. No one knew how it ended up in Reynolds' possession, but now they had more than enough to reopen the case. And Dobson? He'd left town 2 years earlier, after walking free. But once news broke about the investigation into Reynolds, someone anonymously tipped off the BCI about his new address, just outside Boise, Idaho. He was arrested within 48 hours. That same day, Marta received the results of Tank's medical exam. The X-rays confirmed healed rib fractures consistent with abuse, scarring on his hind legs, evidence of prior malnutrition, and embedded deep in the skin near his left shoulder, a partial microchip. It took time, but the number was eventually traced back to a federal canine registry. The original name, K97422B, Sergeant. Registered to a private contractor who had worked security details in Afghanistan. The very same man who had later partnered with Sergeant Martin Daniels in the field. That settled it. Tank had lived 2 lives, one in war, one in survival. And both had been marked by loyalty, pain, and silence. As the full story emerged, news crews descended on Granger once more. But this time, they didn't ask Harper for interviews. They wanted Tank, photos of him resting with children, walking slowly alongside Luis, even dozing under the stars-filled news pages across the country. A documentary team requested permission to film his journey. Harper said no. "He's not a story," she told them. He's a survivor. In private, though, she began gathering every post, every image, every message that people had written about Tank. She wanted to build a scrapbook, not for herself, but for him. A way to honor his memory once his tired body finally gave out, whenever that day came. She didn't want him remembered as the dog who got kicked. She wanted him remembered as the dog who wouldn't give up. And across town, Reynolds sat in a holding cell, awaiting transfer. The same officer who once strutted through Granger like he owned its streets, now stared at concrete walls, ignored by everyone. He'd lost his badge. His pension was under review. and the state attorney had just confirmed formal charges were coming, including obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and aiding and abetting criminal cruelty. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all. Every time the guards passed his cell, they called him by a new nickname. A nickname whispered with grim satisfaction by fellow officers, the man who got outsmarted by a dog. Despite all that had happened, there was still one question echoing quietly through the streets of Granger. Where had Tank been all those years? If he had once belonged to a military handler, if he had disappeared after the war, how did he end up limping down back alleys in a forgotten town like this? Marta was determined to find out. One evening, she invited Harper, Luis, and the widow of Sartakan, Martin Daniels, her name was Irene, for coffee at the animal clinic where she worked. They sat in a small circle, Tank snoozing peacefully on a cushioned mat beside them. The soft hum of crickets filtered in through the screen door. "I had him for almost a year," Irene said, gently stroking Tank's ear. "After Martin died, it was like I had this last piece of him, but I wasn't well. Grief took everything out of me." She looked down. "One night I left the back gate open. Next morning he was gone." Luis nodded slowly. "And no one ever found him?" "No. I put up signs, called shelters. Nothing. It's like he vanished." Marta leaned forward, unfolding a printout of Tank's service history. This microchip fragment came from a foreign registry, likely implanted by the private security company before he worked with Martin. "It's why it didn't show up in our USSR scans. But here's what's interesting." She pointed to a notation in the margin. "He was deployed for 7 months in southern Afghanistan, but the final entry says he was transferred to civilian oversight after Martin's death." Harper furrowed her brow. "Transferred to where?" "No idea. The record stopped there." Marta exhaled. "But someone didn't do their job. He should have gone to a proper home or a sanctuary. Instead, he probably ended up passed around, forgotten, until he landed near that dogfighting ring." Irene wiped a tear from her cheek. "I thought I failed him. But maybe he was trying to come back all along." Tank stirred and placed his head gently on her foot. It was the first time since his return that he'd willingly touched her. That night, Harper posted a photo of the moment, Tank lying quietly by Irene's feet, and captioned it, "Some bonds never break. Even after war, even after loss, some souls remember where they belong." It reached 1.2 million likes in 48 hours, but as the story rippled outward, a new kind of attention began to arrive. Within days, Marta's clinic received dozens of calls from retired canine handlers, veterans, animal advocacy groups, all offering support. One caller stood out, a woman named Dr. Elise Mendel, head of a rehabilitation center for military service dogs in Montana. "We've been tracking Tank's story," she said over the phone, "and we'd like to offer him an honorary sanctuary spot. If he ever wants it, no cages, open fields, medical care. It's a place where old warriors go to rest." Luis hesitated when Marta relayed the offer. "He's got a home here," he said quietly, glancing down at Tank's worn body. "I know," Marta replied, "but I don't think it's about taking him away. It's about letting him choose." So they decided to let Tank see it. 2 days later, Harper, Luis, Marta, and Irene drove with him to Montana. It was a long trip, broken into soft stops and roadside naps, but when they finally arrived, Tank perked up. The sanctuary was everything they'd promised: open pastures, shaded groves, quiet trails. A few other old canines ambled about, each with a story written in the way they walked, in the way they watched the horizon. Tank stood at the edge of the field and stared into the distance for a long time. Then he turned around and limped back to Luis. The choice was made. Back in Granger, a small ceremony was held in front of the sheriff's office, not to bury the scandal, but to celebrate the justice that came from it. A new bench was unveiled near the park fountain, with a bronze plaque embedded in stone. In honor of Sergeant K9 742B, he served without question. He suffered without complaint. He saved without asking for thanks. At the dedication, Harper read a short speech, her voice steady. "We failed him once, but we listened when he cried. We believed when he stood. And we remembered that sometimes the heroes we overlook are the ones who carry the truth with them, even when they can't speak. Luis couldn't stop his hands from shaking when he stood to speak next, but he only said one sentence. I used to think a dog was just a companion. Now I know some of them are legends. As for Officer Reynolds, his trial was set to begin in the fall. He remained behind bars, denied bail after the second search of his property revealed additional evidence tampering in older cases. His lawyer tried to claim mental stress, bias from public outrage, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the court of public opinion had already delivered its own sentence. Tank never knew any of that. He only knew that now when he woke up there was food in a bowl, there were hands that didn't hurt, and there was a porch where he could rest his head without flinching, and perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he knew this. He hadn't just survived injustice, he'd defeated it. Despite everything finally feeling like it had settled, something inside Harper still tugged at her. The video, the glove, the case. They had exposed one man's corruption. But what if there was more? What if Reynolds wasn't the only one who had looked away, or worse, helped cover it all up? She couldn't shake a particular name. Clay Dobson, the man who'd walked free after the dog-fighting ring bust. According to the state's documents, he'd been the suspected organizer, not just a bystander. Yet he'd disappeared without so much as a community service charge, let alone prison. So why had the police let him go? Harper dove into the court records. Most of them were public but incomplete. Some pages were redacted, others were missing entirely. She found one particularly strange note in the DA's case summary. Evidentiary mishandling. Primary witness deemed inadmissible due to chain of custody breach. That primary witness was likely Tank. Marta confirmed it. Animals are often key to prosecuting abuse cases. But if the documentation around their seizure is sloppy, or if the officer involved can't testify properly, it all falls apart. Harper's frustration turned to fire. Someone had made sure that evidence fell apart, and now that Reynolds was behind bars, she was beginning to suspect he didn't do it alone. She brought her suspicions to Sheriff Walton, who'd grown to trust her instincts. We already know Reynolds destroyed a glove, she said. But what about the rest of the evidence? Chains, photos, medical reports. If Dobson was the ringleader, why wasn't more done to keep him here? Walton leaned back in his chair. Because someone wanted him gone. And he was right. An audit launched by the BCI, triggered by Reynolds' arrest, uncovered that 4 pieces of evidence from the Dobson case had disappeared the week after the bust. All signed out under the initials R. But Granger PD had no officer with those initials. It took Marta to connect the dots. What about civilians, interns, technicians? That's when the sheriff's face darkened. Ryan Colburn, he muttered, part-time tech specialist, handled database backups, surveillance video, evidence transfers. He was also Reynolds' nephew. It all began to make sense. Records showed that Ryan Colburn had worked 2 temporary contracts with the department, both during sensitive periods. One right after the dogfighting bust, the other just months before Tank appeared in Granger's streets. Between those 2 stints, Colburn had traveled extensively. Idaho, Nevada, and rural Colorado, the same regions where dogfighting operations had quietly re-emerged, according to the ASPCA. And then Marta remembered something else. The scars on Tank's legs, they weren't all fresh. She pulled up the x-rays. Some of them are older, clean, as if made by a sharp blade, deliberate. Training scars, or fighting scars. Harper's breath caught. You're saying Tank wasn't just a rescued dog? I'm saying, Marta replied carefully, he might have been recaptured, maybe even used again. The room fell silent. Walton called the state task force immediately. Within hours, they issued a federal warrant for Ryan Colburn, but he had already vanished. They traced him to a cabin outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a known hotbed for underground animal fights. But by the time agents arrived, the place was abandoned. No dogs, no files, just burned logs in the fireplace and a single envelope left on the table. It contained a grainy photograph, a dog that looked like Tank, standing in a chain-link cage, muzzle bloodied, eyes hollow. The back was labeled, "They all break eventually." It was like a knife through the chest. Harper refused to let it go. She launched an online campaign with Marta's help. They fined Colburn. It included a $10,000 reward, crowdfunded in just 3 days. Animal lovers, veterans, journalists, and activists all rallied behind the effort. Within a week, tips began to flood in. Someone had seen Colburn at a gas station in New Mexico, buying duct tape and raw meat. Another claimed he was hiding near the border, moving at night with a pit bull in the back of his truck. Nothing was confirmed, but the net was closing. Meanwhile, back in Granger, Tank had become more than a local hero. He was now a symbol, not just of survival, but of resistance. Harper's high school invited her to give a speech at the end-of-year assembly. At first, she refused. "I'm not the hero," she told the principal. "He is." But she eventually agreed. The gym was packed. Tank was there, lying peacefully beside Luis's chair. Harper stood at the podium and looked out over the crowd. "You all know what happened," she began. "You saw the video. You followed the story. But what you didn't see is what came after. The days we spent looking for him. The nights we didn't sleep because we thought maybe he was gone forever. Or worse, that no one would care." She paused. Then she smiled. But people did care. They stood up. They posted. They showed up at that police station not with hate, but with hope. For an old dog. For a truth we couldn't ignore anymore. She looked down at Tank. "You saved more than just yourself. You saved us." The applause was deafening. And somewhere, watching through a cracked phone screen in a motel room on the edge of the desert, Ryan Colburn saw the clip. He didn't comment. He didn't like it. But for the first time since running, he felt something gnawing at him. Fear. Because the dog he thought would disappear had done the unthinkable. He'd come back stronger, and he wasn't done yet. The manhunt for Ryan Colburn stretched into its second week, and what had started as a local story now had national reach. Every major network had picked it up. Talk shows were debating how law enforcement could have allowed a suspected evidence tamperer and potential dogfighting accomplice to operate unnoticed. But for Harper, Marta, and Luis, the news cycle wasn't the focus anymore. Their concern was Tank. The old dog was slowing down. He still wagged his tail when Harper entered the room. He still got up for food, and he still nudged Luis's hand when he wanted a scratch behind the ears, but he tired more easily now. Sometimes his breathing was shallow. Other times, his back legs trembled after too much walking. Marta explained it gently one evening as the three of them sat on Luis's porch. "Trauma doesn't just disappear," she said. "He's lived through war, abuse, abandonment, and now fame. It's a lot for a body that was never meant to carry this weight for so long." Luis nodded, eyes distant. "He saved a town, but we might be losing him." Harper bit her lip. "We have to do something." And they did. With Marta's help, Harper organized something more intimate than viral campaigns and news segments, a ceremony, not for fame, not for cameras, but for closure, for Tank. They called it the Walk of Honor. It would be a short walk through Granger's town square, just a few blocks, lined with friends, veterans, kids, and every person who had stood up when the system failed. The idea was simple. Tank would walk it once, slowly, surrounded by those he had unknowingly brought together. It would be his farewell, whether that meant goodbye to the limelight or something deeper. Word spread quickly. The town printed posters with a silhouette of Tank beneath the words, "Not all heroes wear medals, some walk on 4 legs." The morning of the walk, the square was filled with over 400 people, more than half the town's population. Flags were raised. Children clutched signs that read, "Thank you, Sergeant and Granger's bravest." A local brass quartet volunteered to play a slow rendition of "America the Beautiful." Tank was loaded gently into the back of Luis's truck and driven to the starting point. He stepped down slowly, legs shaking at first until his paws touched the pavement and he steadied. The crowd fell silent. He began to walk. Luis held the leash loosely, letting Tank guide the pace. Harper walked on the opposite side, matching his steps. Behind them, Marta, Irene, and a group of veterans followed, all in respectful silence. It was only a few blocks, but every step felt monumental. People wept, people saluted. Some simply knelt as Tank passed, bowing their heads. Not a single phone was out. Not a single word was spoken until the last few feet, when a small child broke the silence to whisper, He's like a real superhero. When Tank reached the final corner, he paused. Then, as if sensing it, he looked up toward the memorial bench with his name on it. The same one Harper had once sat beside, wondering how to help him. He lowered himself to the ground, rested his chin on his paws, and closed his eyes. For a moment, no one moved. Then the crowd erupted, not in cheering but in soft, sustained applause, a tribute, an acknowledgement, a way of saying thank you that words couldn't carry. And yet, while Tank rested, the world around him was still shifting. That same day, the tip that Harper had been praying for came in. A wildlife photographer named Erica Dalton had spotted a black pickup truck parked deep in the Gila National Forest. She had taken a photo of it for her blog because something about it felt wrong. When she later saw Colburn's face in a news segment, she checked her pictures. The timestamp matched a reported theft at a nearby ranch. The photo clearly showed Colburn's face in the rearview mirror. The authorities acted fast. U.S. Marshals partnered with local law enforcement to raid the remote camp the following morning. When they arrived, Colburn was asleep in the cab of the truck, a pit bull chained to the back bumper. He didn't resist, but the real horror was inside a hidden shed nearby. Bloodstains, syringes, shock collars. It was a training facility, crude, violent, and unmistakably tied to organized dogfighting. Among the evidence seized were handwritten notebooks and a digital drive labeled Canine Inventory. One of the pages listed 742B, resurfaced, Granger, unreliable. Weak. He had known. He had watched. He'd even written about Tank like he was nothing more than a defective tool. And now he would face a courtroom filled with people who had treated that defective tool like a national treasure. Colburn was charged with felony animal cruelty, trafficking, destruction of federal service records, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. But even as the charges mounted, he said nothing. When asked by a reporter, "Do you have anything to say about the dog that exposed you?" he replied only once, "Should have finished the job when I had the chance." That line would come back to haunt him in court, because while Tank had indeed survived, while he'd limped through pain and memory and betrayal, he had never stopped walking. And that was something Colburn would never understand. You don't break a soul like Tank. You just make it stronger. The trial of Ryan Colburn began on a crisp October morning in the Granger County Courthouse. The building, usually quiet and barely occupied, was now surrounded by a crowd so large that deputies had to set up speakers outside to accommodate those who couldn't fit in the gallery. Some came from out of town, many were veterans, others were animal rights activists, but all of them came for one reason: Tank. Harper sat in the second row, flanked by Luis and Marta. Irene Daniels clutched a folded flag in her lap, the same one that had once draped her husband's coffin, and just behind them, quietly resting on a thick blanket beside a heating pad, lay Tank, older, slower, but still very much present. The judge had made a rare exception to allow him inside. "He has earned the right to witness justice," she had said. From the moment the trial began, it was clear the prosecution had built a devastating case. They laid it out piece by piece. The glove Reynolds discarded, the altered records tied to Colburn's technician logins, the photo from the forest showing his face in the mirror, the notebooks found in the cabin, and most damning of all, the digital drive labeled Canine Inventory, which listed Tank as if he were a broken weapon, not a living soul. "Tank is not evidence," the lead prosecutor declared, voice unwavering. "He is a victim, a witness, and a hero." He didn't ask to be dragged into this trial. He didn't choose to be treated like property. But even when others failed him, he remembered what it meant to protect. And he has done so again. The jury was silent. The courtroom hung on every word. Colburn's defense tried to frame him as mentally unstable, manipulated by his uncle, pressured into temporary access to evidence. But their argument unraveled the moment the prosecution showed the timeline. Dobson walks free, and Colburn leaves town. Animal abuse reports spike in the states he travels through. Tank reappears in Granger, days after Colburn is last seen near the town. The line wasn't just logical, it was lethal. But it was Harper's testimony that shook the room to its core. When she took the stand, she didn't recite facts. She told a story. She described the morning she saw the kick, the helplessness, the rage, the silence in the crowd. Then she spoke about the days searching for Tank, the moment he was found, the way he had trusted even after pain. And finally, she held up the laminated comment she had printed out months ago, the one that said, "That dog saved my life too. He's not just a dog," she said, her voice cracking. "He's the reason I believe in right and wrong again. He's the reason I didn't stay quiet." When she stepped down, even the judge took a moment before calling the next witness. That night, the news cycle erupted again. Clips of Harper's words were broadcast nationwide. Hashtags like Trial of Tank and Honor the Canine trended for days. Messages poured in from across the country, letters, voice notes, even donations to shelters in Tank's name. But back in Granger, Marta noticed something. Tank was fading. His appetite had dropped. He slept more. He no longer had the energy for walks, even short ones. She checked his vitals daily and adjusted his pain medication, but she didn't say the words. Not yet. Luis knew. Irene knew. And so did Harper. They didn't talk about it. They just spent more time near him, reading aloud, sitting in silence, letting him feel their presence. The trial lasted 7 days. On the final morning, the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, the courtroom didn't erupt. There was no cheering, no applause, just silence, and the sound of one person quietly sobbing in the back row. Later, Harper would say it was the most respectful moment she had ever witnessed. Colburn was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for the first 18. The judge's statement was brief, but powerful. "You treated a living being like disposable hardware." He responded by revealing your crimes without ever speaking a word. There is no greater indictment of your character than that. But that day held one more surprise. As court adjourned, the U.S. and Army liaison stepped forward. In his hands was a small velvet box. Inside was a custom-forged medal, one never before awarded to a non-active service animal. Engraved were the words, "For courage in silence to Sergeant K9 742B." The room stood as the medal was placed gently beside Tank's paw. And for a single moment, the old dog opened his eyes. He didn't move. He didn't bark. But Harper swore. She saw the tip of his tail twitch, just once. That night, the streets of Granger were quiet. People lit candles. Some stood on their porches in silence. Others simply placed a hand on their heart as they passed the memorial bench. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared say it aloud. The following morning, Harper was the first to arrive at Luis's house. The sun had barely risen, and a soft mist clung to the front yard like a blanket of silence. She didn't need to knock, the door was open. Inside, Marta was already there, her eyes were red. Irene stood nearby, hands clasped tightly, whispering a prayer. Tank was lying on a thick cushion in the living room, surrounded by soft light filtering through the window. His breathing was shallow but peaceful, like a tide slowly pulling away from shore. Luis sat beside him, one hand resting gently on the old dog's rib cage. "He didn't move much last night," he said quietly. "Just looked at each of us one last time, and went still around 3 m. There were no tears at first, just stillness, acceptance, gratitude." They wrapped Tank in a flag Harper had brought, a simple one, a not military issue, but printed with paw prints and stars. Then, in silence, they carried him to the backyard, where a small, handmade cedar coffin had already been prepared. Luis had built it himself the week before. They buried him beneath the tree where he used to lie during summer afternoons, watching butterflies with half-open eyes. And then the town responded. Word spread quickly, and by mid-afternoon, flowers lined the fence outside Luis's home. Children left drawings. One read, "I want to be brave like Tank." Another, "He barked for all of us." Veterans sent ribbons. Police departments from other states sent handwritten notes. One letter, from a former K9 officer in Ohio, simply read, "He was one of us, maybe better." That evening, Harper sat alone in her room and opened her laptop. She hadn't posted since the verdict. She'd wanted to wait. Now, with her hands trembling, she began typing, "Last night we said goodbye to Tank. He didn't go loudly. He didn't go with a fight. He went the same way he lived, with quiet dignity and more strength than most of us will ever know. If you followed his story, if you were one of the thousands who wrote to us, donated, stood outside the courthouse, or simply whispered "good boy" under your breath while watching his walk of honor, then this message is for you. Tank showed us that being silent doesn't mean being weak, that justice doesn't bark, it endures. We buried him under his favorite tree, the place he felt most at peace, and now we keep walking for him. The post went viral in minutes. Within 24 hours, a petition was launched to create a federal medal in Tank's name, to be awarded to service animals and civilian animals who act with extraordinary bravery. Within a week, it had over 1.2 million signatures. Meanwhile, Harper and Marta worked on something smaller but deeply meaningful, a program called Tank's Watch. It would pair at-risk veterans with rescue dogs, training them not only as companions, but as emotional support teams. The first location would open in Granger, funded by donations from across the world. Luis volunteered as the first mentor, and then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while Harper was sorting through a package of letters addressed to Tank's team, she found a worn envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, black and white. Old. It showed a military unit, men crouched beside a series of dogs in front of a plane. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "The first K9 742, 1953, Korea, they always come back." Harper showed it to Marta, stunned. "Do you think?" But Marta just smiled gently. "I think some names carry more than one life. Maybe Tank wasn't the first. Maybe he won't be the last." A week later, at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Tank's Watch, the mayor gave a short speech, choking back emotion. This dog did what laws couldn't, what some humans wouldn't. He reminded us of something we'd forgotten, that even the smallest act of courage, when done at the right moment, can echo forever. Then, with Harper's help, they unveiled a bronze statue. It was Tank, sitting upright, eyes steady, mouth slightly open as if mid-breath. Beneath it, a plaque, Sergeant Tank, K9 742B. He didn't wear armor. He wore scars. He didn't seek glory. He sought the truth. And when others looked away, he stayed. Visitors came from across the country. Children placed stuffed animals at the base. Veterans saluted. One elderly man kneeled and whispered, "Thank you for finishing the mission." Harper stood by the statue long after the crowd had gone. The sun was setting, and golden light bathed the bronze in warmth. For a moment, she imagined she saw a shadow just beyond the statue, old, sturdy, tail wagging once, then fading into the dusk. She smiled, whispering to the wind, "You kept your promise, now rest." As the months passed, the story of Tank, the war dog turned local hero, continued to ripple far beyond Granger's borders. The media attention subsided, but the legacy it sparked was just beginning to take root. Harper found herself receiving letters, emails, and messages from veterans, rescue workers, and dog lovers around the world. Many shared stories of their own service animals, tales of bravery, survival, and silent companionship. Others asked how they could help with Tank's Watch, the program she and Marta had launched to pair rescue dogs with veterans coping with trauma. Luis stayed busy mentoring the first veterans and dogs, watching the bonds form between those who needed each other most. Irene often visited, bringing quiet comfort and sharing memories of her husband, Seiskakse. Martin Daniels, who had first given Tank his name and purpose, but in the heart of it all, a quiet peace settled. Tank's story was no longer just about one dog. It was about the strength of trust, resilience, and the courage to fight even when the world seems to turn its back. One crisp spring morning, Harper and Marta sat together in the small Granger library, reviewing plans for expanding Tank's Watch to other states. The windows framed the gentle bloom of dogwood trees and the steady hum of a town still healing. "Do you ever wonder," Harper asked quietly, "what Tank would think of all this? The statues, the medals, the programs?" Marta smiled thoughtfully. "I think he'd want us to remember the ones who don't come home, the dogs still in the shadows, still waiting for a chance." Harper nodded. "Then we keep walking. For them? At that moment, Luis entered with a letter in his hand, official-looking, embossed with a government seal. He handed it to Harper without a word. She opened it carefully. It was an invitation. The Department of Defense was officially recognizing Sergeant Tank K9742B with the highest civilian honor for animals in the country, the Congressional Medal for Canine Valor. The ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C. months from now. But already plans were underway for a national tribute. Tank's legacy had become a beacon of hope for military animals and their humans alike. Harper, Marta, Luis, and Irene looked at each other, a shared pride mingled with quiet awe. Tank had been a soldier, a survivor, a symbol, and now he would be a legend. But above all, Tank remained what he had always been, simply a dog who never stopped walking. Thank you for watching this incredible story of Sergeant Tank, a dog who showed us the true meaning of courage and loyalty. If Tank's journey touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of animals and humans who change the world together. Don't forget to click the next video to continue exploring amazing tales that prove sometimes heroes come on 4 legs.